On the 18th of August in 1920, Harry T. Burns cast the deciding vote in a Tennessee courthouse to make the 19th Amendment, which said that the right to vote could not be denied or reduced on the basis of sex, officially adopted into the United States Constitution. Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment. But how did we get to this point of triumph? The answer lies 72 years before, in the summer of 1848, when the Seneca Falls Convention was held. Elizabeth Cady Stanton led around 300 people, mostly women, at the convention in Seneca Falls, New York, in starting the first organized U.S. women's suffrage movement. She later formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NWSA, with Susan B. Anthony, another renowned suffrage activist. Its initial rivals, the American Women's Suffrage Association, or AWSA, was founded in part by Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Brown Blackwell. They were both formed in 1869, and although they both fought for women's suffrage, their main split was on the 15th Amendment. This amendment said that the right to vote could not be denied because of skin color or previous condition of servitude. However, it omitted any mention of sex or gender, and this caused the NWSA to disapprove of it, as their focus was on women's suffrage, as opposed to suffrage for all. The AWSA, on the other hand, wanted suffrage for all, so they supported the 15th Amendment. In 1890, the two groups put aside their differences and joined together to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. NAWSA mainly focused on individual state suffrage, rather than trying to take on Congress and go for national suffrage. Because she felt unsatisfied with the slow pace, in 1916, Alice Paul, with the help of fellow suffragette Lucy Burns, started the National Woman's Party, or NWP, a political organization whose only objective was getting Congress to pass the 19th Amendment. Eventually, after being continually pressured by the NWP, President Woodrow Wilson spoke out in support for the women's suffrage movement, and Congress officially passed the amendment. It wasn't long before the suffragettes had the 36 required states and women were able to vote nationwide. Though the 19th Amendment was not officially passed in Congress until 1919, many states had already granted women the right to vote. These states included California, Wyoming, Michigan, New York, and Oklahoma. Some other states had varying degrees of suffrage, like Texas, which only let women vote in their primaries, or Vermont, which allowed women only to vote in municipal elections. The majority of states had some degree of suffrage, but some, mainly parts in the South, had no suffrage whatsoever. When the 19th Amendment was officially passed, Illinois was the first to ratify it, followed by much of the Midwest and some of the Northeast. By the end of 1919, 22 states had ratified the amendment, and in 1920, 13 more states formalized it in over a span of only 3 months. Tennessee ratified it in August of 1920, and was followed by Connecticut and Vermont. Unfortunately, it took 65 years for all the states to approve the amendment, and most of the later years were spent with the southern states. One person important to the suffrage movement was President Woodrow Wilson. Because of his presidency, Wilson had enormous power that could help suffragettes win the vote or make it extremely hard to. While privately supporting the women's rights movement, Wilson initially stayed quiet, partially because of strong opposition from the southern states to any constitutional amendment whatsoever. This was not a problem for him at first, but suffragists from the NWP, led by Alice Paul, started attacking Wilson personally during the Silent Sentinel picketing of the White House, where suffragettes held banners discrediting Wilson and often throwing his own words back at him. They even took to burning his speeches. Eventually, President Wilson decided to support women's suffrage with a speech before Congress in 1918. In this speech, Wilson said, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?" Later that year, the House of Representatives passed the 19th Amendment, and Wilson kept pressuring the Senate, which was stalling the amendment, to vote for it. Finally, in June of 1919, the Senate approved the amendment after President Wilson told them that it was vital to winning the war. Communication was vital to the suffrage movement, as how else could the leaders coordinate such a large movement across an entire nation? The women's suffrage movement is directly related to communication because throughout the movement, people were communicating to speak their opinions to help our society grow. Without communication, we would not have secured the right for women to vote in the USA. Some ways the suffragettes communicated to the government and people of America was through speeches and petitions to the government. Some other more attention-gaining ways of communicating were marches, picketing, and other forms of civil disobedience. Some of the most famous examples of suffragette communications are the 1913 March on Washington and the Silent Sentinels picketing of the White House. Organized by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns for NAWSA, the women's suffrage procession was the first large organized march on Washington, D.C. for political purposes. Planning for the march began in December 1912, and the march took place on Monday, March 3, 1913, the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Between 5,000 and 10,000 marchers went down Pennsylvania Avenue that day, and in addition, there was an allegorical tableau staged at the Treasury building that was set to begin at the same time as the parade, at 3 o'clock. In the end, due to the resistance from the D.C. Police Department, crowds stormed the suffragettes, and as a result, some people got trampled. Alice Paul used the event to promote awareness of the suffrage movement and also, after the chaos at the parade, sympathy for the movement. Alice Paul also helped organize the Silent Sentinels picketing as one of the leaders of NWP. Also known as the Sentinels of Liberty, this group of suffragettes protested in front of the White House during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, starting on January 10, 1917. After meeting with Wilson the day before, where he told the women to concert public opinion on behalf of women's suffrage. The group then stood outside the White House holding banners to silently remind the public of President Wilson's lack of support for suffrage. As endurance for the women grew thin, many were arrested. By June 4, 1919, when the Senate passed the 19th Amendment, nearly 500 women had been arrested, and over 160 served jail time. The Silent Sentinel picketing is a key example of communication in the women's suffrage movement. In short, the goal of women's suffrage movement was to get Congress to pass the 19th Amendment, which secured voting rights for people on the basis of sex. The suffragettes involved in this movement communicated their message of equal rights through marches, speeches, petitions to Congress, and other such demonstrations. On August 18, 1920, in a Tennessee courthouse, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified and became law in all of the United States of America.